Hey guys, tonight we journey to the ends of the earth, to a place where the sun doesn't set for months, and then doesn't rise for months more. A place where the cold doesn't just bite, it kills. Where men went seeking glory, gold, and geographic immortality, only to find slow, agonizing death in the most remote corners of our planet. Tonight, we're talking about what really happened to failed Arctic explorers. And let me tell you, it's not the romantic adventure story you learned in school. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship, surrounded by an endless expanse of white. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. The wind cuts through your wool coat like it's made of paper. Your breath freezes in the air before it can escape your lungs. And in every direction, as far as the eye can see, there's nothing but ice. Jagged, shifting, crushing ice that groans and screams as it moves. This ice doesn't care about your mission, your country, or your family back home. It has one job: to kill you, slowly. For centuries, men looked at maps and saw blank spaces in the north. They saw opportunity. They saw fame. They saw the Northwest Passage, a mythical route through the Arctic that would revolutionize global trade. They saw scientific discovery, national pride, and personal glory. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly understand until it was too late, was that the Arctic isn't just cold, it's alive, it's predatory, and it's very, very patient. The stories you're about to hear aren't tales of brave adventurers who died heroically in pursuit of knowledge. They're horror stories. Stories of men who slowly went insane in the endless darkness. Stories of cannibalism, of lead poisoning, of watching your friends die one by one while you wait for your turn. Stories of expeditions that started with brass bands and champagne toasts and ended with scattered bones on frozen beaches, picked clean by polar bears and ravens. Because here's the truth about Arctic exploration that the history books gloss over. Most of these men didn't die quickly. They didn't freeze to death in their sleep or get eaten by polar bears. They died slowly, over months or even years, as their bodies and minds deteriorated in ways that would make a horror novelist wince. They died of scurvy, their teeth falling out, and their old wounds reopening. They died of starvation, eating their leather boots and then each other. They died of lead poisoning from badly soldered food cans, hallucinating and convulsing as their nervous systems shut down. They died alone, in the dark, writing final letters that would never be delivered. And the most terrifying part? Many of them knew they were going to die long before it happened. They wrote about it in their journals. They calculated how many days of food they had left. They watched the ice close in around their ships and knew that rescue wasn't coming. They felt their bodies failing, day by day, and there was nothing they could do but wait. The Arctic has swallowed entire expeditions without a trace. Ships, men, supplies, all vanished into the white void as if they never existed at all. Some of these lost souls weren't found for decades. Others were never found at all. And when we did find them, what we discovered was often worse than if they'd simply disappeared forever. So settle in, because tonight we're going to explore what really happened when Victorian gentlemen in wool coats tried to conquer the most hostile environment on Earth. We're going to follow their footsteps into the ice, and we're going to see exactly why the Arctic earned its reputation as the graveyard of explorers. We're going to discover what happens when human ambition meets absolute, merciless cold. And trust me, it's not pretty. Let's begin with the most famous Arctic disaster of all time. A disaster so complete, so mysterious, and so horrifying that it's become the gold standard for failed polar exploration. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you about the Franklin expedition. It was May 19th, 1845, when Sir John Franklin sailed from England with two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and 129 of the finest men the Royal Navy had to offer. Franklin was 59 years old, a veteran explorer with multiple Arctic expeditions under his belt. The ships were state-of-the-art, fitted with steam engines, central heating, libraries full of books, and enough provisions to last 3 years. The crew was experienced, well-trained, and confident. The mission was simple: find the Northwest Passage and claim it for the British Empire. What could go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything. Franklin's expedition was supposed to be the culmination of decades of Arctic exploration. The British had been probing the Arctic archipelago for years, mapping islands, charting waters, and slowly piecing together what they hoped would be a navigable route through the ice. Franklin's job was to connect the dots, to find the final link in the chain that would open the Arctic to commercial shipping. The last confirmed sighting of Franklin's ships was in July 1845, when they were spotted by a whaling vessel in Baffin Bay. After that, they simply vanished. 129 men, 2 massive ships, and enough supplies to feed a small army, all swallowed by the Arctic as if they'd never existed. Back in England, nobody was worried at first. 3 years of provisions meant the expedition wasn't expected back until 1848 at the earliest. But when 1848 came and went, with no word from Franklin, alarm bells started ringing. By 1850, the Royal Navy had launched a massive search effort, sending multiple expeditions to scour the Arctic for any trace of the missing men. What they found, piece by piece over the next decade and a half, was a story of unimaginable horror. The first clues came in 1850, when searchers found the remains of Franklin's first winter camp on Beechey Island. 3 graves, neatly arranged, marked the resting places of 3 crew members who had died during the first winter. But there was something wrong with these graves. When modern scientists exhumed the bodies in the 1980s, they found that the men had died not just from cold and disease, but from acute lead poisoning. The lead soda used to seal their food cans had leached into their supplies, slowly poisoning the entire crew. But Beechey Island was just the beginning. The real horror lay further south, scattered across King William Island, like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to hell. In 1854, Arctic explorer John Ray encountered Inuit hunters who told him disturbing stories. They spoke of white men who had been seen years earlier, dragging boats and sleds across the ice, starving and desperate. They spoke of bodies found scattered across the frozen landscape. And they spoke of something else, something that made the Victorian public recoil in horror when Ray reported it back to London. Cannibalism. The Inuit told Ray that they had found bodies that showed clear signs of having been butchered for food. Cut marks on bones, skulls cracked open to access the brain. The systematic dismemberment of human corpses by men so desperate that they had resorted to eating their comrades to survive. The British public refused to believe it. Sir John Franklin was a hero, a gentleman, a devout Christian. His men were officers and gentlemen of the Royal Navy. Such men would never, could never, resort to such barbarism. The very suggestion was seen as an insult to British honour. But the Inuit were right. Over the next several decades, more and more evidence emerged. Bodies were found scattered across the Canadian Arctic, often in groups, sometimes alone. Ships' boats were discovered hundreds of miles from where the ships had been abandoned, filled with bizarre collections of items. Silver spoons and forks, but no food. Heavy books and writing materials, but no warm clothing. It was as if the men had completely lost their ability to make rational decisions about what was necessary for survival. The story that emerged from these scattered clues was one of almost incomprehensible suffering. After becoming trapped in ice somewhere north of King William Island, Franklin's men had waited through one winter, then another, then another. Sir John Franklin himself died on June 11th, 1847, though the cause of his death remains unknown. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, who faced an impossible situation. The ships were trapped. The ice wasn't melting. Supplies were running low. And what food they had was poisoning them. Men were dying of scurvy, their bodies breaking down as their vitamin C stores were depleted. Others were showing signs of lead poisoning, confusion, aggression, hallucinations. The expedition's medical officer was powerless to help, lacking any understanding of what was killing his patients. In April 1848, Crozier made the decision that doomed them all. He ordered the ships abandoned. 105 men, the survivors of the original 129, set out across the ice on foot, dragging boats and sleds loaded with supplies. Their plan was to march south to the Back River, then follow it to a Hudson's Bay Company outpost, hundreds of miles away. It was a desperate gamble, but staying with the ships meant certain death. The march was a nightmare from the beginning. The men were already weakened by 2.5 years of poor nutrition, scurvy, and lead poisoning. They were trying to drag heavy boats across rough ice in temperatures that could drop to 50 degrees below zero. Many were already showing signs of mental deterioration, making irrational decisions and behaving erratically. One by one, they began to fall. The weak were left behind, either dead or dying, as the stronger men pressed on. Equipment was abandoned when it became too heavy to carry. Food supplies dwindled and then disappeared entirely. And as starvation set in, the surviving men faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make. They could die with their honor intact, or they could eat the dead and live a little longer. They chose to live. The evidence of what happened next is written in the bones found scattered across King William Island. Cut marks made by knives and saws, bones cracked open to extract marrow, skulls split to access the brain. The systematic butchering of human corpses by men who had been driven beyond the boundaries of civilization by hunger and desperation. But even cannibalism couldn't save them. One by one, the survivors continued to die, until finally, somewhere in the endless expanse of ice and snow, the last man fell. Some may have made it as far as the mainland, dying alone on some anonymous beach with rescue still hundreds of miles away. Others died on the ice, their bodies eventually washing up on distant shores years later. Not a single man from Franklin's expedition survived to tell the tale. The Franklin expedition wasn't just a disaster, it was a revelation. It showed the world that the Arctic wasn't just cold and dangerous, it was a place where the fundamental assumptions of civilization broke down, where good men could be driven to acts of unspeakable desperation, where the most advanced technology of the age was useless against the simple, brutal reality of cold and ice. But Franklin's was not the only expedition to disappear into the Arctic's hungry maw. Oh no, there were many others. Men who thought they could succeed where Franklin had failed. Men who believed that with better planning, better equipment, or better luck, they could conquer the unconquerable. They were all wrong. Let me tell you about George Washington DeLong and the USS Jeannette. Another expedition that started with high hopes and ended in frozen horror. In 1879, Lieutenant Commander DeLong set sail from San Francisco with a crew of 33 men aboard the USS Jeannette, a converted yacht that had been reinforced for Arctic conditions. DeLong's mission was to reach the North Pole by way of the Bering Strait, following ocean currents that were supposed to carry his ship north through the ice to the top of the world. The theory was elegant. The reality was catastrophic. DeLong's expedition was based on the work of August Petermann, a German geographer who believed that warm ocean currents created an area of open water around the North Pole. According to Petermann's theory, all DeLong had to do was penetrate the initial belt of pack ice, and he would find himself in relatively ice-free waters that would carry him straight to the pole. Petermann was completely wrong. Instead of finding open water, DeLong found himself trapped in pack ice just north of the Siberian coast. The Jeannette was caught like a fly in amber, frozen solid in ice that showed no signs of melting. For nearly 2 years, the ship drifted helplessly with the ice pack, carried slowly northwest by the polar current. Life aboard the trapped Jeannette was a slow-motion nightmare. The men had enough food and fuel for the moment, but they were completely at the mercy of the ice. They couldn't escape, couldn't call for help, couldn't do anything but wait and hope that the ice would eventually release them. The psychological strain was enormous. Men who had signed up for a glorious voyage of discovery found themselves prisoners in a frozen wasteland, watching the ice slowly crush their ship. The endless Arctic night, lasting for months at a time, drove some of them to the edge of madness. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. Some men became withdrawn and depressed, refusing to eat or participate in ship's activities. Others became aggressive and paranoid, convinced that their shipmates were plotting against them. De Long himself struggled to maintain discipline and morale. He organized classes, encouraged the men to write in their journals, and tried to keep everyone busy with scientific observations and ship maintenance. But there was only so much that leadership could do in the face of such psychological pressure. On June 11th, 1881, after 21 months trapped in the ice, the Jeannette finally succumbed to the crushing pressure. The ice had been slowly squeezing the ship for months, and despite the crew's best efforts to shore up the hull, the vessel finally gave way. Water poured into the hold, and it became clear that the ship was doomed. De Long ordered his men to abandon ship and prepare for a march across the ice to the Siberian coast, still hundreds of miles away. They loaded 3 boats onto sleds, along with as much food and equipment as they could carry, and set out across the shifting pack ice. The journey was horrific from the beginning. The ice was constantly moving and breaking up, forcing the men to detour around leads of open water or wait for new ice to form. Sometimes they would march for hours only to find that the ice had drifted in the opposite direction, cancelling out all their progress. The temperature regularly dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the men suffered from frostbite, exhaustion, and malnutrition. After weeks of brutal marching, the expedition finally reached the edge of the pack ice and launched their 3 boats into the open water of the Laptev Sea. They were still far from safety, but at least they were making progress toward the Siberian coast. Then the storm hit. A vicious Arctic gale scattered the 3 boats, separating the crew into 3 groups that would never see each other again. De Long's boat, carrying 14 men, was blown far to the west. The second boat, under the command of Chief Engineer George Melville, managed to reach the Lena Delta. The third boat, with 8 men aboard, simply vanished. Melville's group was the lucky one. They reached the coast in relatively good condition and were rescued by local Yakut natives who guided them to safety. Melville himself would survive to mount rescue expeditions for his missing comrades. De Long's group was not so fortunate. They made landfall on a barren stretch of the Lena Delta, exhausted, starving, and without adequate shelter. De Long had managed to save his journal, and his final entries provide a heartbreaking account of their last days. The men were dying one by one from starvation and exposure. They had no warm clothing, no proper shelter, and virtually no food. De Long tried to maintain discipline and hope, sending out search parties to look for help and rationing their meager supplies. But it was hopeless. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, in one of the most desolate regions on Earth. De Long's final journal entry was dated October 30th, 1881. Boyd and Gertz died during the night, Mr. Collins dying. The bodies of De Long and his men were found the following spring by a rescue party led by Melville. They had been huddled together in a crude shelter made from driftwood and canvas, trying to conserve warmth. De Long was found with his journal clutched in his frozen hands, having written almost until the moment of his death. The third boat was never found. 8 men simply vanished into the Arctic waters, leaving no trace behind. The Jeannette expedition was a disaster that revealed the fundamental futility of trying to reach the North Pole by ship. De Long had been defeated, not by lack of courage or preparation, but by the simple reality that the Arctic Ocean was not the ice-free sea that geographers had imagined. It was a frozen wasteland that crushed ships and killed men with ruthless efficiency. But even as De Long was dying in the Lena Delta, other men were already planning new assaults on the Arctic. The lure of the North Pole, of fame and national glory, was too strong to resist, and so the tragedies continued. Let me tell you about Salomon August André, a Swedish engineer who thought he could fly to the North Pole in a hydrogen balloon. In 1897, André and two companions, Nils Strindberg and Knut Frankel, launched themselves into the Arctic sky from Danes Island in Svalbard, Norway. Their balloon, named Örnen, the Eagle, was supposed to carry them over the ice to the North Pole and then on to either Alaska or Siberia. The flight was expected to take no more than a few days. It was one of the most spectacularly foolish expeditions in the history of Arctic exploration. André's plan was based on several fundamental misconceptions about Arctic weather and balloon technology. He believed that the winds over the Arctic Ocean would carry his balloon in a predictable direction. He thought that his steering system, a collection of drag ropes and sails, would allow him to control the balloon's course. And he was convinced that even if something went wrong, he and his companions could land safely on the ice and walk to safety. He was wrong about everything. The Eagle lifted off from Danes Island on July 11th, 1897, watched by an international audience of journalists and well-wishers. For a few hours, it seemed like the expedition might actually succeed. The balloon rose to a good altitude and began drifting north toward the pole. André dropped messages from the basket, reporting their position and expressing confidence in their ultimate success. Then everything went wrong. The balloon was losing hydrogen faster than expected, probably due to the cold Arctic air and the weight of ice forming on the balloon's surface. André's steering system proved useless. The drag ropes either froze to the ice or became tangled in pressure ridges. Worst of all, the winds were not carrying them toward the pole, but pushing them east toward the empty wastes of the Arctic Ocean. After just 65 hours in the air, the Eagle crash-landed on the pack ice about 300 miles north of Svalbard. André and his companions found themselves in exactly the situation they had hoped to avoid, stranded on the shifting ice, hundreds of miles from land, with limited supplies and no realistic hope of rescue. But André was an optimist. He was convinced that they could walk to safety, either to Franz Josef Land to the east, or back to Svalbard to the south. He salvaged what supplies he could from the balloon and set out across the ice with his two companions. The march was a nightmare from the beginning. The ice was constantly moving, often carrying them backward, faster than they could walk forward. They were not equipped for Arctic travel on foot. Their clothing was inadequate, their food supplies were limited, and they had no experience with ice navigation. Worst of all, they were traveling during the Arctic summer, when the ice was at its most unstable and dangerous. For nearly 3 months, André, Strindberg, and Frankel struggled across the shifting pack ice, dragging sleds loaded with equipment salvaged from the balloon. They shot polar bears and seals when they could. But hunting was difficult and dangerous. The constant dampness and cold made it almost impossible to keep their equipment dry or their bodies warm. By early October, it was clear that they would not reach safety before winter set in. The three men made camp on a small ice floe, planning to wait out the winter and resume their march in the spring. They built a crude shelter from salvaged balloon fabric and driftwood and settled in for what they hoped would be a temporary stay. It became their tomb. The exact details of what happened to André and his companions remained a mystery for 33 years. In 1930, a Norwegian expedition found their remains on Kvitoya, a small island in the Svalbard archipelago. The bodies were remarkably well preserved by the cold, and with them were found André's diary, Strindberg's photographs, and a detailed record of their final months. The story told by these artifacts was one of gradual deterioration and ultimate despair. Strindberg, the youngest of the three, died first, probably in early October 1897. The exact cause of his death is unknown, but it was likely a combination of exposure, malnutrition, and possibly trichinosis from eating undercooked polar bear meat. André and Frankel survived a few weeks longer, but they too eventually succumbed to the cold and their deteriorating physical condition. André's final diary entries reveal a man who had finally come to terms with the futility of his situation. The optimism and confidence that had carried him through the early stages of the expedition had given way to grim acceptance of his fate. The three men were found lying in their makeshift shelter, their bodies arranged as if they had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Strindberg was found some distance away, having apparently crawled away from the others before dying alone. André's balloon expedition was a perfect example of how Arctic exploration could go catastrophically wrong. His plan had been based on wishful thinking, rather than realistic assessment of the dangers involved. He had underestimated the harsh realities of Arctic weather and overestimated his ability to control his balloon in those conditions. Most fatally, he had no backup plan for what to do if the balloon failed. The result was 3 unnecessary deaths and another reminder that the Arctic did not forgive mistakes. But perhaps no Arctic disaster illustrates the slow, grinding horror of polar exploration better than the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, led by Adolphus Greely. This was an expedition that started as a routine scientific mission and ended in cannibalism, murder, and madness. In 1881, First Lieutenant Adolphus Washington Greely of the United States Army led 24 men to Lady Franklin Bay in the Canadian Arctic as part of the first International Polar Year. Their mission was straightforward: establish a weather station, conduct scientific observations, and wait for a relief ship to pick them up after 2 years. It should have been routine. It became a nightmare. Greely's expedition was part of an international effort to study Arctic weather and magnetic phenomena. 12 countries had established research stations around the Arctic Circle, and the American station at Lady Franklin Bay was expected to be one of the most productive. Greely was an experienced Army officer, and his men were carefully selected for their skills and reliability. The first year went according to plan. The expedition established Fort Conger at Lady Franklin Bay, conducted their scientific observations, and settled in for the long Arctic winter. Morale was good, supplies were adequate, and everyone looked forward to the arrival of the relief ship in the summer of 1882. The relief ship never came. Unknown to Greely and his men, the ship sent to resupply them had been blocked by unusually heavy ice and forced to turn back. A second ship made it closer to Lady Franklin Bay, but was also blocked by ice. The relief expedition managed to leave a small cache of supplies at Cape Sabine, about 250 miles south of Fort Conger, but they had no way to notify Greely of its location. As winter set in for the second time, Greely faced a terrible decision. He could stay at Fort Conger, where his men were relatively comfortable, but where supplies were running low, or he could follow his original orders, which called for him to retreat south to Cape Sabine if no relief ship arrived. Greely chose to follow orders. In August 1883, he led his 24 men south in small boats, hoping to find either a relief ship or the supply cache that had been left for them. They found the cache, but it contained only enough food for a few weeks. With winter approaching and no sign of rescue, Greely and his men were trapped. Cape Sabine was a desolate place, a barren stretch of rocky coastline with no shelter and no resources. The men built a crude hut from stones and canvas and settled in to wait for rescue. They had enough food to last until spring if they rationed it carefully, but there was no margin for error. The winter of 1883-84 was one of the worst in Arctic history. Temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero, and howling winds made it dangerous to venture outside the hut. The men huddled together for warmth, trying to conserve their strength and their sanity. Food became an obsession. Greely instituted strict rationing, doling out meager portions of bacon, hardtack, and condensed milk. When those ran out, the men turned to anything edible they could find. Leather boots, sleeping bags, even the glue used to bind books. They scraped lichen off rocks and boiled it into a thin soup. They caught and ate a few seals. But hunting was difficult in the extreme cold. As starvation set in, the men began to deteriorate both physically and mentally. They lost weight rapidly, their bodies consuming muscle and fat to stay alive. Their gums became swollen and bloody from scurvy. Some developed frostbite so severe that their fingers and toes turned black and had to be amputated. Others showed signs of mental breakdown, talking to imaginary friends, or becoming convinced that their comrades were plotting against them. Discipline began to break down. Some men hoarded food, stealing from the common supplies, or taking more than their share when distributing rations. Others became listless and depressed, refusing to help with daily tasks or to take care of their personal hygiene. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, and Greely struggled to maintain order. In January 1884, the expedition's photographer, George Rice, died of starvation and cold. He was the first to go, but he would not be the last. Over the next few months, one by one, Greely's men succumbed to the combination of starvation, scurvy, and exposure. And then, as the survivors grew more desperate, they crossed a line that Greely had hoped they would never have to cross. They began to eat the dead. It started with one man, Private Charles Henry, who was caught stealing food from the common store. Henry had been taking more than his share for weeks, and his theft was literally taking food out of the mouths of his starving comrades. In a moment of desperation and rage, Greely ordered Henry shot. Henry's body was left outside in the snow, and soon the survivors were faced with a horrific temptation. Here was meat, fresh meat, at a time when they were literally dying of starvation. The decision to resort to cannibalism was not made lightly or quickly. It was the result of weeks of agonizing debate and soul-searching among men who knew they were on the brink of death. Finally, unable to bear the hunger any longer, some of the survivors began to cut flesh from Henry's body. They cooked it carefully, trying to convince themselves that this was simply another form of meat, no different from seal or bear. But the psychological impact was devastating. Men who had been trained soldiers and civilized human beings found themselves eating human flesh to survive. The cannibalism did not save them. If anything, it made their situation worse by adding psychological trauma to their physical suffering. Some men were unable to bring themselves to eat human flesh and continued to starve. Others ate it but were overcome with guilt and horror at what they had done. The thin veneer of civilization that had held the group together for so long finally collapsed entirely. By the time rescue finally arrived in June 1884, only 6 men remained alive out of the original 25. They were skeletal figures, barely recognizable as human beings. Their eyes were sunken deep in their skulls, their skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Some were too weak to stand or speak coherently. All bore the psychological scars of what they had endured. Greely himself survived, though he was forever haunted by the decisions he had made during that terrible winter. He was later court-martialed for the death of Private Henry, though the charges were eventually dropped in recognition of the extreme circumstances he had faced. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition became a scandal when news of the cannibalism reached the public. Like the Franklin expedition before it, it challenged comfortable assumptions about civilization and human nature. It showed that even well-trained, disciplined men could be reduced to savagery when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. But Greely's expedition was not the last to end in tragedy. The Arctic continued to claim victims, drawn by the promise of fame, discovery, and national glory. Let me tell you about Robert Falcon Scott and his doomed race to the South Pole. While most of our story has focused on the Arctic, the Antarctic proved equally deadly to explorers who underestimated its power. Scott's Terra Nova expedition of 1913 was supposed to be Britain's triumphant claim to the South Pole. Instead, it became one of the most famous disasters in polar history. Scott's plan was ambitious. He would lead a team to the South Pole, conduct scientific research along the way, and return home as a national hero. He had attempted to reach the pole once before, in 1904, and had learned valuable lessons from that experience. This time, he was confident, would be different. Scott's expedition was well funded and carefully planned. He brought motor sledges, ponies, dogs, and skis for transportation across the Antarctic ice. His team included some of the finest explorers and scientists of the day. The ship, Terra Nova, was loaded with enough supplies for several years. Everything seemed to be in Scott's favour, except for one thing: Roald Amundsen. The Norwegian explorer had originally planned to attempt the North Pole. But when he learned that Frederick Cook and Robert Peary were already racing for that goal, he secretly changed his plans. Instead of going north, Amundsen would go south. He would beat Scott to the South Pole. Scott didn't learn of Amundsen's change of plans until he reached Melbourne, Australia, on his way to Antarctica. There he received a telegram from Amundsen. "Beg leave to inform you proceeding Antarctic." Amundsen. The race was on. Scott reached Antarctica in January 1911. and established his base camp at Cape Evans on Ross Island. Over the next several months, he and his team laid supply depots along the route to the pole and conducted scientific research. The plan was to begin the polar journey proper in November 1911, at the start of the Antarctic summer. From the beginning, things went wrong. Scott's motor sledges broke down almost immediately, leaving deep in the snow. The ponies, which Scott had insisted on bringing despite advice to use dogs instead, proved unsuited to Antarctic conditions. They sweated through their thick coats, then froze when they stopped moving. One by one, they had to be shot. Scott's team was also hampered by poor weather and difficult terrain. The Antarctic ice was rougher than expected, filled with crevasses and pressure ridges that made travel slow and dangerous. The men were constantly exhausted from pulling heavy sledges across the uneven surface. On January 17th, 1912, Scott and 4 companions finally reached the South Pole, only to find a Norwegian flag already planted there. Amundsen had beaten them by 34 days. The disappointment was crushing. Scott wrote in his diary, "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it, without the reward of priority. But reaching the pole was only half the journey. Now Scott and his men had to get back to base camp, a journey of more than 800 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The return journey was cursed from the beginning. Edgar Evans, the strongest man on the team, began showing signs of mental and physical deterioration. He had suffered a head injury in a fall and was probably suffering from a concussion, but there was no way to treat him properly in the field. He became confused and erratic, slowing down the entire team. Evans died on February 17th, 1912, at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. His death was a devastating blow to morale, and it left the remaining 4 men to continue the journey without their strongest member. Next to fail was Lawrence Oates, a cavalry officer who had joined the expedition. Despite having no previous polar experience, Oates had been suffering from frostbitten feet for weeks, and the injury was getting progressively worse. By early March, he could barely walk, and his condition was slowing down the entire team. On March 17th, Oates made a decision that has become legendary in the annals of exploration. Rather than continue to burden his companions, he walked out of the tent into a blizzard, saying, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He was never seen again. Oates's sacrifice did not save his companions. Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers continued their struggle toward base camp, but they were fighting a losing battle against time, weather, and their own failing bodies. Food was running low, fuel was almost gone, and they were still more than 150 miles from safety. On March 21st, 1912, they pitched their tent for the last time. A blizzard had pinned them down just 11 miles from One Ton Depot, where supplies were waiting, but they were too weak to continue, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Scott's final diary entries provide a heartbreaking account of their last days. The men lay in their sleeping bags, too weak to move, waiting for death to come. Scott wrote letters to the wives and families of his companions, taking responsibility for the disaster and praising the courage of his men. His final entry, dated March 29th, 1912, ended with the words, "We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker." Of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. For God's sake, look after our people. The bodies of Scott, Wilson, and Bowers were found 8 months later by a search party. They were lying in their tent, still in their sleeping bags, with Scott's diary and letters preserved by the cold. The tent had been almost completely buried by snow, and only the tip of a ski sticking up through the surface marked their grave. Scott's expedition was a disaster that could have been avoided. Unlike some of the other tragedies we've discussed, this was not a case of men being defeated by completely unforeseen circumstances. Scott made a series of poor decisions that contributed directly to his team's death. He chose to rely on ponies instead of dogs, despite advice from experienced polar travelers. He underestimated the amount of food and fuel his team would need for the return journey. He decided to take 5 men to the pole instead of 4, which strained their supplies. Most critically, he failed to adequately prepare for the possibility of bad weather on the return journey. Amundsen, by contrast, succeeded because he planned more carefully and made better decisions. He used dogs for transportation, which were better suited to Antarctic conditions than ponies. He left larger supply depots along his route. He brought more food and fuel than he thought he would need. And he turned back as soon as he reached the pole, rather than lingering to conduct scientific observations. The difference between success and failure in polar exploration often came down to such seemingly small details. A few extra pounds of food, a better choice of transportation, a decision to turn back a day earlier. Any of these could mean the difference between life and death. But even when explorers made all the right decisions, the polar regions could still claim them. The cold was patient, the ice was treacherous, and human beings were fragile creatures trying to survive in an environment that was fundamentally hostile to life. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of polar exploration: what the cold actually did to the human body. When we talk about people freezing to death, we tend to imagine it as a relatively quick and peaceful process. The reality was far more brutal. Hypothermia doesn't kill quickly. It kills slowly, over hours or even days, as the body's core temperature gradually drops. In the early stages, victims feel cold and start shivering as their bodies try to generate heat. As the condition progresses, they become confused and disoriented. Their speech becomes slurred, their movements become clumsy, and they may start making irrational decisions. In the later stages of hypothermia, victims often experience what's called paradoxical undressing. They feel hot and start removing their clothes, even though they're actually freezing to death. This is because the blood vessels in their extremities, which have been constricted to preserve heat for vital organs, suddenly dilate, creating a brief sensation of warmth. Many hypothermia victims are found partially or completely naked, having removed their protective clothing in the final stages of dying. Frostbite was another constant threat. When exposed to extreme cold, the body shunts blood away from the extremities to protect vital organs. This leaves fingers, toes, nose, and ears vulnerable to freezing. In mild cases, frostbite causes pain and swelling. In severe cases, the affected tissue actually freezes solid and dies. Many polar explorers lost fingers, toes, or even entire hands and feet to frostbite. Some, like Admiral Peary, lost most of their toes but continued exploring. Others were less fortunate. The pain of severe frostbite is excruciating, described by victims as feeling like being burned with hot irons. And there was no effective treatment in the field. Explorers simply had to endure the pain and hope that infection wouldn't set in. But cold was not the only killer in the polar regions. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a constant threat on long expeditions. The disease begins with fatigue and joint pain, but it progresses to much more serious symptoms. Victims' gums become swollen and bloody. Their teeth loosen and fall out, and old wounds reopen and refuse to heal. In the advanced stages of scurvy, victims develop massive bruises under their skin as blood vessels rupture. They become weak and depressed, and eventually they die from internal hemorrhaging or secondary infections. Scurvy was particularly common on naval expeditions, where crews relied on preserved foods that contained no vitamin C. The psychological effects of polar exploration were just as devastating as the physical ones. The combination of extreme cold, isolation, and constant danger took a heavy toll on explorers' mental health. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The long polar night was particularly hard to endure. For months at a time, the sun never rose above the horizon, leaving explorers in constant darkness. This disrupted their sleep patterns and contributed to depression and disorientation. Some men became paranoid, convinced that their companions were plotting against them. Others became withdrawn and apathetic, losing interest in food, hygiene, and their own survival. Cabin fever was a real phenomenon on expeditions where men were confined together in small spaces for months at a time. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. personality conflicts became magnified to the point where men who had been friends could barely stand to be in the same room together. Some expeditions were torn apart by internal conflicts that were just as dangerous as any external threat. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Polar explorers were cut off from the rest of the world for months or years at a time. They had no way to communicate with home, no way to call for help, and no way to know whether rescue was coming. This isolation created a sense of helplessness and despair that could be just as deadly as the cold. Many explorers wrote in their diaries about feeling abandoned by the outside world. They began to doubt whether anyone cared about their fate, or whether anyone was even looking for them. This doubt could lead to a kind of psychological collapse where men simply gave up the will to live. The combination of physical and psychological stress created a downward spiral that was often impossible to break. Men who were cold, hungry, and in pain were more likely to make poor decisions. Poor decisions led to worse conditions, which led to more stress and more poor decisions. Eventually, this cycle could lead to complete breakdown and death. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of polar exploration was what happened when civilized men were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. We've already discussed the cannibalism that occurred on the Franklin and Greely expeditions, but it's worth examining this phenomenon more closely because it reveals something fundamental about human nature under extreme stress. Cannibalism was the ultimate taboo in Victorian society. It was associated with primitive savages, not with educated gentlemen of the British or American navies. The very suggestion that civilized men might resort to eating human flesh was seen as deeply offensive and insulting. Yet when faced with starvation, even the most refined and religious men could be driven to acts that would have horrified them under normal circumstances. The transition from civilized behavior to cannibalism didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that began with small compromises and escalated as conditions grew more desperate. First, explorers would eat their leather equipment, boots, belts, harnesses, anything that might provide a few calories. Then they would turn to substances that were technically edible but disgusting. Paint made from linseed oil, glue made from animal parts, candles made from animal fat. When those options were exhausted, they faced the ultimate choice: die of starvation, or eat human flesh. Some men could never bring themselves to cross that line, preferring to die with their moral principles intact. Others rationalized that they were simply making use of meat that would otherwise go to waste. Still others were driven beyond the point of rational thought by hunger and desperation. The psychological impact of cannibalism was devastating. Men who had been driven to eat human flesh were haunted by guilt and self-loathing. They knew that they had violated one of the most fundamental taboos of their society, and they feared that they had damned themselves both morally and spiritually. Some became deeply religious, spending hours in prayer and seeking forgiveness for their actions. Others became withdrawn and depressed, unable to live with what they had done. The knowledge that they had eaten human flesh to survive followed them for the rest of their lives, if they were lucky enough to survive at all. The cannibalism on polar expeditions also revealed the thin veneer of civilization that separates humans from animals. Under extreme stress, the social norms and moral principles that govern human behavior can break down remarkably quickly. Men who had been raised as Christians and gentlemen could be reduced to behavior that was barely distinguishable from that of wild animals. This was perhaps the most disturbing lesson of polar exploration, that civilization itself was fragile and could be stripped away by cold, hunger, and desperation. The men who returned from failed polar expeditions were often fundamentally changed by their experiences. They had seen what humans were capable of when pushed to the very limits of survival, and they could never quite forget it. But cannibalism was not the only horror that awaited polar explorers. Lead poisoning was another silent killer that claimed many lives and drove others to madness. The problem started with the food cans. In the 19th century, canned food was a relatively new technology, and the techniques for sealing cans were still primitive. Many cans were sealed with lead solder, which seemed like a good idea at the time because lead was cheap, easy to work with, and created a strong seal. What the manufacturers didn't know was that acidic foods could cause the lead solder to leach into the food inside the can. Over time, People who ate large quantities of canned food would accumulate dangerous levels of lead in their bodies. The effects of lead poisoning were gradual and often mistaken for other conditions. Early symptoms of lead poisoning include fatigue, headaches, and stomach pain. As the condition progresses, victims may experience confusion, memory loss, and behavioral changes. In severe cases, lead poisoning can cause convulsions, coma, and death. On polar expeditions, where canned food made up a large portion of the diet, lead poisoning was a serious problem. The cold Arctic environment may have made the problem worse by causing the lead solder to become more brittle and prone to flaking off into the food. The Franklin expedition is the most famous example of lead poisoning on a polar expedition. When the bodies of Franklin's men were exhumed in the 1980s, scientists found extremely high levels of lead in their hair, nails, and bones. The lead poisoning may have contributed to the expedition's failure by impairing the men's judgment and ability to make rational decisions. Lead poisoning could explain some of the bizarre behavior exhibited by members of failing polar expeditions. Men who left behind essential supplies while carrying useless items. Leaders who made obviously poor decisions despite their experience and training. Crew members who became paranoid, aggressive, or delusional. The combination of lead poisoning, hypothermia, starvation, and psychological stress created a perfect storm of factors that could drive men to madness. It's no wonder that so many polar expeditions ended in disaster. Another major killer on polar expeditions was carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated shelters. When explorers were trapped by bad weather, they would often seal themselves into small tents or huts to conserve heat. But if they used oil lamps, candles, or stoves for heat and light, they risked poisoning themselves with carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is an odorless, colorless gas that binds to hemoglobin more readily than oxygen. Victims of carbon monoxide poisoning often don't realize what's happening to them because the gas causes them to become drowsy and confused. They may simply lie down for a nap and never wake up. Many polar explorers died in their sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning, victims of their own efforts to stay warm. Their companions might find them in the morning, apparently peaceful but stone dead, with no obvious cause of death. The polar regions were also home to predators that posed a constant threat to human life. Polar bears in the Arctic and leopard seals in the Antarctic were apex predators that viewed humans as potential prey. Polar bears were particularly dangerous because they were intelligent, adaptable, and completely unafraid of humans. A full-grown polar bear could weigh more than 500 pounds, and run faster than a human across ice or snow. They had an excellent sense of smell and could track human scent across miles of ice. Many polar explorers were stalked by polar bears for days or weeks. The bears would follow at a distance, waiting for an opportunity to attack. They were known to raid camps, stealing food and equipment, and sometimes attacking humans who got too close. Leopard seals in the Antarctic were equally dangerous in the water. These massive seals, which could grow to more than 12 feet long and weigh 10 pounds, were aggressive predators that sometimes attacked humans who ventured onto ice floes or into the water. Even smaller Arctic animals could be deadly. Arctic foxes and wolves sometimes followed expeditions, scavenging for food. While they rarely attacked healthy humans directly, they posed a threat to wounded or weakened explorers. Ravens and gulls could strip flesh from corpses, making it difficult to identify bodies found years later. The wildlife of the polar regions had adapted to an environment where anything edible was fair game. Humans were just another source of meat in a landscape where food was scarce and survival was everything. But perhaps the most insidious danger faced by polar explorers was the ice itself. Polar ice was not the solid, stable platform that many people imagined. It was a dynamic, ever-changing environment that could crush ships, swallow entire expeditions, or simply carry explorers away from their intended destinations. Sea ice was particularly treacherous. It could look solid from a distance, but turn out to be only a few inches thick. Explorers who trusted their weight to seemingly solid ice sometimes broke through and drowned in the frigid water below. Even if they managed to get out of the water, they faced almost certain death from hypothermia, unless they could get warm and dry immediately. Pressure ridges were another constant hazard. These formations occurred when two ice flows collided, pushing up walls of broken ice that could be dozens of feet high. Pressure ridges were extremely difficult to cross, especially when pulling heavy sleds, and they could form without warning as ice flows shifted and moved. Crevasses in glacial ice were hidden traps that could swallow an unwary explorer in an instant. Many crevasses were covered by thin layers of snow that looked solid but could not support a person's weight. Explorers who fell into crevasses often could not be rescued, especially if they were traveling alone or if their companions lacked the equipment to pull them out. The ice was also constantly moving. Ocean currents and winds could carry ice flows hundreds of miles from their original positions. Explorers who thought they were camped safely on solid ice sometimes woke up to find themselves drifting helplessly toward open water or being carried away from their intended destination. This happened to several Arctic expeditions, including the Jeanette crew we discussed earlier. Men who thought they were walking towards safety sometimes found that the ice was carrying them backward faster than they could walk forward. The result was a frustrating and ultimately deadly race against time and the elements. The ice also had a psychological effect on explorers. The constant groaning, cracking, and shifting of ice could be deeply unsettling, especially during the long polar night. Men reported being kept awake by the sounds of ice moving around their camps, never knowing whether the next crack might split the ground beneath their feet. Some explorers developed what could only be described as ice phobian, irrational fear of the ice that could paralyze them and prevent them from making necessary decisions. Others became obsessed with the ice, spending hours watching it move and trying to predict its behavior. The ice was a living thing in the polar regions, and it had its own agenda. It did not care about human plans or ambitions. It moved according to its own laws. And humans who got in its way were simply crushed, drowned, or carried away to die alone in the vast white wilderness. Weather in the polar regions was another deadly enemy that claimed many lives. Polar storms could arise without warning, bringing winds of more than 100 miles per hour and temperatures that dropped to unimaginable depths. These storms could last for days or weeks, trapping explorers in their tents or shelters with no way to travel or hunt for food. Whiteout conditions were particularly dangerous. When snow and wind combined to create zero visibility, explorers could become lost within yards of their camps. Many men wandered off into storms and were never seen again, their bodies eventually found miles away from where they had disappeared. The wind chill effect made already dangerous temperatures even more deadly. A temperature of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, combined with a 30-mile-per-hour wind, created conditions equivalent to -80 degrees. At such temperatures, exposed flesh could freeze in minutes. Polar explorers learned to read weather signs, like their lives depended on it because they did. Changes in wind direction, the behavior of animals, the color of the sky, all could provide clues about incoming storms. But even experienced explorers could be caught off guard by sudden weather changes. Many expeditions were destroyed not by a single catastrophic event, but by a series of storms that gradually wore down their supplies, equipment, and morale. Each storm left them a little weaker, a little more vulnerable to the next one. Eventually, even minor weather events could become deadly to explorers who had been pushed to the limits of their endurance. The cumulative effect of all these dangers cold, ice, weather, wildlife, disease, poisoning, and psychological stress created an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human life. The polar regions were not just cold and difficult, they were actively trying to kill anyone who ventured into them. This is why so many polar expeditions ended in disaster. It wasn't enough to be brave, skilled, or well prepared. Explorers needed to be lucky, and they needed to stay lucky for months or years at a time. A single mistake, a moment of bad luck, or an unforeseen circumstance could doom an entire expedition. The men who ventured into the polar regions were not fools or incompetents. Many of them were among the most skilled and experienced explorers of their time. They understood the dangers they faced, and they prepared as well as they could with the technology and knowledge available to them. But the polar regions were simply beyond the ability of 19th and early 20th century technology to conquer safely. The equipment was inadequate, the understanding of polar conditions was incomplete, and the margin for error was essentially zero. This brings us to one of the most tragic aspects of polar exploration. The fact that many of these expeditions failed not because of the explorers' incompetence, but because of factors beyond their control. Take the Franklin expedition, for example. Franklin and his men were experienced Arctic explorers who had survived previous expeditions. Their ships were the most advanced of their time, equipped with steam engines, reinforced hulls, and central heating. They carried enough food for 3 years and had the backing of the British Admiralty. What they didn't know was that they were sailing into one of the worst periods of Arctic ice in recorded history. Climate research has shown that the 1840s were particularly cold in the Arctic, with ice conditions that were unusually severe even by polar standards. The Northwest Passage, which had been partially navigable in previous years, was completely blocked by ice during Franklin's expedition. Similarly, Scott's Terra Nova expedition was hampered by unusually bad weather on the return journey from the South Pole. The temperatures Scott's team encountered were significantly lower than the historical average for that time of year. Had the weather been more typical, Scott and his men might have made it back to base camp safely. Even well-planned expeditions could be doomed by factors that were completely outside the explorer's control or knowledge. Changes in weather patterns, shifts in ice conditions, or simple bad luck could turn a routine expedition into a disaster. This element of chance made polar exploration a form of gambling with human lives. No matter how careful the planning or how skilled the explorers, there was always the possibility that unforeseen circumstances would prove fatal. The psychological pressure of knowing this must have been enormous. Polar explorers were constantly aware that they were walking a tightrope between life and death, and that factors beyond their control could tip them into the abyss at any moment. Many explorers wrote in their diaries about feeling like they were at the mercy of fate or divine providence. They understood that their survival depended as much on luck as on skill, and this knowledge added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. The randomness of survival in the polar regions also created survivor's guilt among those who did make it home. Why had they lived when their companions died? What made them worthy of survival when better men had perished? These questions haunted many survivors for the rest of their lives. George Melville, who survived the Jeannette disaster, spent years trying to find and rescue his missing companions. He organized multiple search expeditions and never gave up hope that some of his men might still be alive. When the bodies of DeLong and his men were finally found, Melville was devastated by guilt that he hadn't been able to save them. Adolphus Greely similarly struggled with guilt over the men who died under his command during the Lady Franklin Bay expedition. He was court-martialed for the death of Private Henry and faced criticism for his leadership during the crisis. Though he was eventually cleared of wrongdoing, he never fully recovered from the trauma of what he had experienced. The polar regions created a unique form of trauma that was difficult for outsiders to understand. People who had never experienced extreme cold, isolation, and the constant threat of death found it hard to comprehend what polar explorers had endured. This lack of understanding often made it difficult for survivors to readjust to normal life. Many polar explorers became obsessed with returning to the ice, despite their previous suffering. They seemed unable to settle into ordinary civilian life after experiencing the intensity and danger of polar exploration. Some made multiple expeditions, each one more dangerous than the last, as if they were addicted to the combination of fear and excitement that came with risking their lives in the polar regions. Others became reclusive and withdrawn, unable to relate to people who had not shared their experiences. They struggled with depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. In an era before mental health was well understood, these men often suffered in silence. The families of polar explorers also paid a heavy price. Wives and children were left behind for months or years at a time, never knowing whether their husbands and fathers would return home safely. Many families were destroyed by the financial and emotional costs of polar exploration. The wives of polar explorers often became advocates for search and rescue efforts when their husbands went missing. Lady Franklin, the wife of Sir John Franklin, spent her own fortune organizing search expeditions and lobbying the British government to continue looking for her husband. She never gave up hope that Franklin and his men might still be alive, even as evidence mounted that they had all perished. The children of polar explorers grew up in the shadow of their father's fame and sacrifice. Some became explorers themselves, trying to live up to their father's legacies. Others rejected exploration entirely, wanting nothing to do with the polar regions that had claimed their fathers' lives. The human cost of polar exploration extended far beyond the men who died in the ice. It affected entire families and communities, creating ripples of grief and trauma that lasted for generations. Yet despite all the death, suffering, and failure, polar exploration continued. New expeditions were organized, new volunteers stepped forward, and new attempts were made to conquer the unconquerable. Why did men continue to venture into regions that had already claimed so many lives? Part of the answer lies in the powerful psychological appeal of polar exploration. The polar regions represented the ultimate challenge, the final frontier where human beings could test themselves against the most extreme conditions on Earth. For men raised on stories of heroic adventure and imperial conquest, the poles offered a chance to prove their worth and secure their place in history. National pride was also a powerful motivator. In an era of intense competition between European powers and the United States, polar exploration became a form of proxy warfare. To reach the North or South Pole first would demonstrate a nation's technological superiority, organizational skills, and moral fiber. The prestige associated with polar firsts was enormous, and governments were willing to invest heavily in expeditions that might bring national glory. Scientific curiosity was another driving force. The polar regions were among the last unexplored areas on Earth, and they held the promise of important geographical and scientific discoveries. Understanding polar weather patterns, mapping uncharted territories, and studying polar wildlife could advance human knowledge in significant ways. There was also the simple human desire to push boundaries and go where no one had gone before. The poles represented absolute challenges, geographical points that could not be moved or changed, only reached. For explorers driven by ambition and curiosity, the poles were irresistible targets. Economic factors played a role as well. The Northwest Passage, if it could be found and navigated safely, would revolutionize global trade by providing a much shorter route between Europe and Asia. Whaling and sealing in polar waters were profitable industries that drove exploration and mapping of polar regions. Finally, there was the addictive nature of polar exploration itself. Men who had experienced the intensity and camaraderie of polar expeditions often found ordinary life boring and meaningless by comparison. They were drawn back to the ice by the same psychological forces that drive people to engage in other extreme activities. The combination of all these factors created a steady stream of volunteers for polar expeditions, even as the casualty rates remained horrifically high. Each new expedition was convinced that it would succeed where others had failed, that better planning, better equipment, or better luck would make the difference. Sometimes these optimists were right. Gradually, through trial and error, and the sacrifice of many lives, human beings did learn how to survive in the polar regions. Better clothing, better food preservation, better understanding of polar conditions, and eventually better technology made polar exploration somewhat less deadly. But the learning process was slow and paid for in blood. Each successful expedition built on the failures and discoveries of those that came before. The men who died in the ice were not just victims, they were unwilling teachers whose suffering and death provided valuable lessons for future explorers. Roald Amundsen's successful expedition to the South Pole in 1911 was based on careful study of previous failures. Amundsen learned from Scott's mistakes in choosing transportation. He used dogs instead of ponies. He learned from earlier expeditions about the importance of careful food planning and depot laying. He studied Inuit survival techniques and adapted them to polar exploration. Amundsen succeeded not just because he was skilled and well prepared, but because he was able to learn from the failures of those who came before him. His success was built on a foundation of other men's deaths. This pattern repeated throughout the history of polar exploration. Each failure taught valuable lessons about what not to do, what equipment didn't work, what planning was inadequate. Gradually, these lessons accumulated into a body of knowledge that made polar exploration somewhat more survivable. But even today, with all our modern technology and understanding, the polar regions remain dangerous places. People still die in Antarctica and the Arctic, despite having GPS, satellite communication, modern clothing, and rescue services that would have seemed miraculous to 19th century explorers. The fundamental challenge remains the same. Human beings are not designed to survive in environments where the temperature can drop to 100 degrees below zero, where the sun doesn't shine for months at a time, and where a simple mistake can be fatal. We can mitigate these dangers with technology and preparation, but we cannot eliminate them entirely. The polar regions remain alien environments where human life exists only through constant vigilance and careful preparation. They are places where the margin for error is still razor thin, and where the consequences of failure are still death. The stories of failed polar expeditions serve as reminders of human limitations and the price of hubris. They show us what happens when human ambition collides with the absolute indifference of nature. They demonstrate that there are still places on Earth where humans are not the dominant species, where we are merely visitors who survive only by grace of good planning and good luck. These stories are also testaments to human courage and determination. The men who died in the polar regions were not victims of their own stupidity or recklessness. They were pioneers who pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and capability, often at the cost of their own lives. Their failures were as meaningful as their successes, providing valuable lessons about human endurance, leadership, and survival. The polar regions have claimed thousands of lives over the centuries, but they have also inspired some of the greatest examples of human courage and sacrifice in history. Men like Lawrence Oates, who walked out into a blizzard to save his companions, or Edgar Evans, who continued working despite serious injuries until he could go no further, embodied virtues that transcend their specific historical circumstances. The failed polar expeditions also reveal something important about human nature under extreme stress. They show us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary heroism when circumstances demand it, but also that even the best people can be driven to desperate acts when pushed beyond their limits. The cannibalism on the Franklin and Greely expeditions was not evidence of moral failure, but of the fundamental human drive to survive. The men who resorted to eating human flesh were not monsters. They were human beings who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. These expeditions also demonstrate the importance of leadership under extreme conditions. Leaders like Adolphus Greely and Robert Falcon Scott faced decisions that no amount of training could have prepared them for. They had to maintain discipline and morale among men who were starving, freezing, and dying. They had to make life and death decisions with incomplete information and no possibility of outside help. Some of these leaders succeeded in maintaining their authority and the cohesion of their groups, even under the most extreme circumstances. Others failed, and their expeditions dissolved into chaos and recrimination. The difference often came down to intangible qualities of character and leadership that are difficult to measure but essential for survival in extreme situations. The legacy of failed polar expeditions extends far beyond the specific historical events themselves. They have become part of our cultural mythology, stories that we tell ourselves about human courage, sacrifice, and the price of ambition. They remind us that progress often comes at a cost, and that knowledge is sometimes paid for with human lives. These stories continue to fascinate us because they represent the eternal human struggle against the limits imposed by nature and circumstance. They show us people facing the ultimate test of their character and finding out what they are truly made of. Some rise to heroic heights, others fall to depths they never imagined possible. All reveal something essential about what it means to be human. The polar regions themselves continue to evolve. Climate change is dramatically altering the Arctic ice, opening up passages that were blocked for centuries and changing the environment that defeated so many early explorers. The Northwest Passage that Franklin died trying to find is now increasingly navigable due to melting sea ice. In some ways, this makes the sacrifices of early polar explorers seem even more poignant. They died trying to accomplish goals that are now routine. Ships regularly transit the Northwest Passage during summer months. Tourists visit the North and South Poles on guided expeditions. What was once impossible has become merely expensive. But this accessibility comes with its own costs. The same climate change that is opening Arctic shipping lanes is also destroying the ecosystem that polar animals depend on. The pristine wilderness that early explorers died trying to reach is now threatened by industrial development and environmental degradation. The polar regions remain important for scientific research, particularly in understanding climate change and its effects. Modern researchers work in the same places where early explorers died, but they do so with the benefit of technology, communication, and logistical support that would have seemed magical to 19th century expeditions. Yet even today's researchers acknowledge their debt to the early explorers. The basic techniques of polar survival, importance of proper clothing, nutrition, and shelter were learned through the trials and errors of men like Franklin, Scott, and Greely. Modern polar research builds on a foundation laid by explorers who paid for their knowledge with their lives. The stories of failed polar expeditions remind us that human progress is not inevitable or easy. Every advance in knowledge, every expansion of human capability, comes at a cost. Sometimes that cost is measured in money or effort. Sometimes it is measured in human lives. The men who died in the polar regions were not the last to pay this price. Explorers continue to die in space, in the deep oceans, in mountain ranges, and in other extreme environments where humans push the boundaries of the possible. Their deaths are part of the ongoing human effort to understand and explore our universe. These modern explorers, like their polar predecessors, are driven by a combination of scientific curiosity, personal ambition, and the simple human need to go where no one has gone before. They know the risks they face, just as Franklin and Scott knew the risks they faced. They accept those risks because they believe that the potential rewards in knowledge, achievement, or simple personal satisfaction justify the dangers. The tradition of polar exploration, with all its triumphs and tragedies, continues today in new forms. The same human drives that sent men to die in the Arctic and Antarctic now send them to die in space or in the deepest parts of the ocean. The specific challenges change, but the fundamental human impulse to explore and push boundaries remains constant. The failed polar expeditions of the 19th and early 20th centuries are not just historical curiosities. They are part of the ongoing human story of exploration and discovery. They remind us of the price that progress sometimes demands, and the courage that progress sometimes requires. They also remind us that failure can be as meaningful as success. The expeditions that ended in disaster often taught more valuable lessons than those that succeeded. They showed future explorers what didn't work, what dangers to avoid, and what preparations were necessary for survival. In this sense, the men who died in the polar regions were not failures but pioneers. They paid with their lives for knowledge that would benefit all humanity. Their deaths were not meaningless, but meaningful in the deepest sense. They advanced human understanding and capability, even if they did not live to see the benefits of their sacrifice. The polar regions that claimed so many lives remain dangerous today, but they are no longer the blank spaces on the map that they were in the 19th century. They have been explored, mapped, studied, and understood. We know their dangers and their challenges. We can visit them with reasonable safety, though never without risk. This transformation from unknown wilderness to studied environment is the ultimate legacy of the failed polar expeditions. The men who died in the ice did not die in vain. They died so that we could understand what they could not understand, so that we could go safely where they could not go safely, so that we could learn from their mistakes and build on their achievements. Their stories continue to inspire and warn us. They show us what humans are capable of when driven by curiosity and ambition. They also show us what happens when we underestimate the power of nature or overestimate our own capabilities. The frozen bodies of polar explorers, preserved by the cold for decades or centuries, serve as monuments to human ambition and human frailty. They remind us that we are still small and vulnerable creatures in a vast and often hostile universe. They teach us respect for the forces we seek to understand and explore. But they also demonstrate that humans are capable of extraordinary courage and determination when faced with impossible odds. The men who died in the polar regions did not give up easily. They fought for their lives and the lives of their companions until the very end. They maintained their humanity even when driven to desperate acts. They left records of their experiences so that others could learn from their suffering. In the end, the failed polar expeditions represent both the best and worst of human nature. They show us capable of great courage and great cruelty, of noble sacrifice and desperate selfishness, of brilliant planning and catastrophic mistakes. They remind us that we are complex creatures, capable of both inspiration and disappointment. The polar regions themselves remain as beautiful and terrible as they ever were. The ice still moves and groans. The wind still cuts like a knife. The cold still kills the unwary and unprepared. The basic challenges that defeated Franklin and Scott remain unchanged by all our technological progress. What has changed is our understanding. We know now what the early explorers could only guess at. We understand the effects of cold on the human body, the importance of proper nutrition, the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning and lead contamination. We have learned from their mistakes and built on their achievements. But most importantly, we have learned to respect the polar regions for what they are. Beautiful, alien environments where human life exists only through careful preparation and constant vigilance. They are not places to be conquered, but places to be survived. The legacy of failed polar exploration extends into our modern understanding of extreme environments and human psychology. NASA studies the journals and records of polar explorers to understand how humans cope with isolation, extreme conditions, and the psychological pressures of long-duration missions. The lessons learned from Franklin's lead poisoning inform modern food safety. The organizational failures of Scott's expedition provide case studies in crisis management and leadership under pressure. Medical researchers have learned volumes from the preserved bodies of polar explorers. The mummified remains found in the Arctic have provided insights into 19th century diseases, nutrition, and the long-term effects of extreme cold exposure. Forensic anthropologists have been able to piece together the final days of lost expeditions by examining cut marks on bones, analyzing stomach contents, and studying the distribution of bodies across the landscape. These scientific studies, conducted with modern technology on century-old remains, have confirmed many of the horror stories that Victorian society preferred to dismiss. The evidence of cannibalism is undeniable. The effects of lead poisoning are clearly visible in hair and bone samples. The signs of scurvy, starvation, and desperate struggle for survival are written in the very bones of the dead. But these studies have also revealed the incredible resilience and determination of the human spirit. Men who were slowly dying of multiple diseases continued to write in their journals, continued to care for their comrades, continued to hope for rescue, or at least to leave a record of their experiences for future generations. The psychological profiles that emerge from these studies paint a picture of ordinary men pushed to extraordinary extremes. They were not superhuman heroes or villainous cannibals, but complex human beings trying to survive in conditions that no human should have to endure. Their responses to extreme stress were as varied as their personality. Some became leaders, others followers. Some maintained hope, others succumbed to despair. Some retained their humanity, others were driven beyond the bounds of civilization. What emerges most clearly from the scientific study of failed polar expeditions is the incredible importance of small details. A few extra pounds of vitamin C could have prevented scurvy. Better understanding of ventilation could have prevented carbon monoxide poisoning. Different techniques for food preservation could have prevented lead poisoning. More appropriate clothing could have prevented frostbite. Any one of these small changes might have saved entire expeditions. This highlights one of the most tragic aspects of polar exploration: how close many expeditions came to success. The margin between life and death was often razor thin. Scott's team died just 11 miles from a supply depot. Franklin's men might have survived if they had understood the effects of lead poisoning. Greely's expedition might have avoided cannibalism if their rescue had arrived just a few weeks earlier. The what-if scenarios are endless and heartbreaking. What if Franklin had chosen a different route through the Arctic archipelago? What if Scott had brought dogs instead of ponies? What if André had tested his balloon more thoroughly before attempting to fly to the North Pole? Any one of these small changes might have resulted in triumph instead of tragedy. This element of chance and narrow margins makes the stories of failed polar expeditions even more poignant. These men were not doomed by fate or destiny. but by a series of small mistakes and bad luck that accumulated into catastrophe. Their failures serve as reminders of how fragile human life is and how small the margin for error can be in extreme environments. The technological advances that have made modern polar exploration safer are impressive, but incremental. Better clothing materials provide more insulation and breathability. Improved food preservation eliminates the risk of lead poisoning and provides better nutrition. Advanced communication systems allow explorers to call for help when things go wrong. GPS navigation prevents explorers from getting lost in whiteout conditions. But fundamentally, humans venturing into polar regions still face the same basic challenges that defeated Franklin and Scott. The cold is still deadly. The ice is still dangerous. The isolation is still psychologically devastating. The margin for error is still small. We have better tools to deal with these challenges, but we have not eliminated them. Modern polar explorers still die, though much less frequently than their 19th century counterparts. They die from equipment failures, from falls into crevasses, from sudden weather changes, from simple accidents that would be minor inconveniences in temperate climates, but prove fatal in the polar regions. Each death is a reminder that the fundamental hostility of the polar environment remains unchanged. The democratization of polar exploration through guided expeditions and adventure tourism has made the polar regions accessible to ordinary people rather than just professional explorers. This has generally improved safety through better logistics and support systems, but it has also created new risks as people with less experience and preparation venture into dangerous environments. Some critics argue that modern adventure tourism trivializes the sacrifices of early polar explorers by turning their life and death struggles into expensive vacation experiences. Others contend that making the polar regions accessible to more people helps us better understand and appreciate what early explorers endured. Both perspectives have merit. There is something almost obscene about wealthy tourists sipping champagne at the North Pole while surrounded by the memorials of men who died trying to reach the same spot. But there is also value in allowing people to experience, even in a sanitized form, the environments that shaped so much polar exploration history. Modern expeditions to retrace the routes of failed polar expeditions have provided valuable insights into what those early explorers experienced. Reenactment expeditions using period equipment and techniques have demonstrated just how difficult and dangerous polar travel was in the 19th century. These expeditions have also shown how small improvements in equipment and techniques could have made enormous differences in survival rates. Some modern explorers have deliberately subjected themselves to the same conditions that early explorers faced, using period clothing, food, and navigation techniques. These experiments have provided visceral understanding of what men like Franklin and Scott endured. They have also demonstrated that success or failure often came down to tiny margins, a slightly better sleeping bag, a more nutritious food ration, or a navigation error of just a few degrees could mean the difference between life and death. The psychology of modern polar exploration has also evolved significantly. Early explorers were often driven by national pride, personal glory, and the desire to make geographical discoveries. Modern explorers are more likely to be motivated by personal challenge, environmental awareness, or scientific research. The shift from exploration for territorial gain to exploration for understanding reflects broader changes in how humans view their relationship with nature. Climate change has added a new dimension to polar exploration and research. The Arctic ice that defeated so many early explorers is now melting at unprecedented rates. The Northwest Passage that Franklin died trying to find is now regularly navigated by commercial shipping. The polar bears that stalked early expeditions are now threatened by habitat loss. This environmental transformation makes the stories of failed polar expeditions even more poignant. The pristine wilderness that early explorers died trying to reach is now threatened by the same industrial civilization that sent them there. The ice that crushed their ships is melting due to emissions from the coal-powered steamships that followed them. Modern polar research is increasingly focused on understanding and documenting these environmental changes. Scientists work in the same locations where early explorers died, but instead of seeking geographical discoveries, they are documenting ecological collapse. The remote weather stations that dot the polar regions now serve as early warning systems for global climate change rather than aids to navigation. The irony is profound. The same human drive to explore and exploit that sent Franklin and Scott to their deaths is now threatening the very environments they died trying to understand. The technological civilization that eventually conquered the polar regions is now destroying them through inadvertent climate modification. This adds a layer of environmental tragedy to the human tragedies of polar exploration. The men who died in the ice were not just victims of cold and starvation, but early casualties of humanity's complex and often destructive relationship with the natural world. Their deaths were part of the same historical process that now threatens the polar regions themselves. The indigenous peoples of the polar regions, whose knowledge might have saved many failed expeditions, were largely ignored or dismissed by early explorers. The Inuit who told John Ray about the fate of Franklin's expedition were not believed by the British public, who could not accept that their heroes had resorted to cannibalism. The survival techniques that allowed Arctic peoples to thrive in polar conditions for thousands of years were considered primitive and unsuitable for civilized explorers. This cultural arrogance contributed to many polar disasters. Explorers who insisted on using European techniques and equipment in environments where they were inappropriate paid for their cultural chauvinism with their lives. The irony is that the indigenous peoples whom they dismissed as savages possessed knowledge that could have saved them. Modern polar research has increasingly recognized and incorporated traditional indigenous knowledge. Inuit guides now work with scientific expeditions, sharing techniques for ice navigation, weather prediction, and survival that have been refined over millennia. This collaboration has improved both safety and scientific understanding. The recognition of indigenous knowledge also adds another dimension of tragedy to early polar exploration. How many lives might have been saved if explorers had been willing to learn from people who actually lived in polar environments? How different might polar exploration have been if it had been guided by collaboration rather than conquest? These questions cannot be answered, but they serve as reminders that cultural humility might have prevented many polar disasters. The assumption that European civilization was superior to all others led explorers to ignore survival techniques that had been proven effective over centuries of use. The gender dynamics of polar exploration also deserve examination. Early polar expeditions were exclusively male enterprises, often explicitly justified as tests of masculine virtue and national virility. The all-male composition of these expeditions created unique psychological pressures and social dynamics that may have contributed to their failures. Modern research on group dynamics suggests that the inclusion of women in polar expeditions might have improved decision-making, reduced conflict, and enhanced overall expedition performance. Women have since proven themselves equally capable of surviving and thriving in polar conditions, challenging early assumptions about gender and extreme environment survival. The exclusion of women from early polar expeditions was based on cultural prejudices rather than practical considerations. This exclusion deprived expeditions of potentially valuable skills and perspectives that might have improved their chances of success. The homoerotic undertones of many polar expedition accounts also deserve acknowledgement. The intense male bonding that developed during long polar expeditions sometimes took on romantic or sexual dimensions that participants could not openly acknowledge in the repressive sexual climate of the Victorian era. These suppressed sexual dynamics may have created additional psychological pressures that contributed to expedition failures. Men who were already stressed by extreme conditions and isolation had to deal with sexual tensions and romantic attachments that could not be openly discussed or resolved. The psychological toll of maintaining rigid masculine personas while experiencing intense emotional connections with other men may have been significant. Some polar explorers wrote about their companions in language that was clearly romantic, even if they could not admit it to themselves. Understanding these hidden dimensions of polar exploration psychology helps explain some of the seemingly irrational behaviors that contributed to expedition failures. Men making poor decisions under stress may have been influenced by emotional factors that they could not acknowledge or address. The racial and ethnic dimensions of polar exploration also shaped outcomes in significant ways. Most early polar expeditions were led by white Europeans or Americans who brought with them assumptions about racial superiority that affected their interactions with indigenous peoples and their approach to polar survival. The few non-white members of polar expeditions often faced discrimination and exclusion that may have affected expedition dynamics and performance. Matthew Henson, the African-American explorer who accompanied Robert Peary to the North Pole, was largely excluded from the credit and recognition that his white companions received, despite his crucial contributions to the expedition's success. The assumption that white Europeans possessed superior intelligence and moral character led many expedition leaders to dismiss the knowledge and advice of indigenous peoples who actually understood polar survival. This racial arrogance contributed to preventable deaths and expedition failures. The class dynamics of polar exploration were equally important. Early expeditions were typically led by upper-class officers who had little practical experience with manual labor or survival skills. The actual work of polar exploration, hauling sleds, setting up camps, maintaining equipment, was done by working-class sailors and soldiers who often possessed more relevant skills than their social superiors. The rigid class hierarchies of 19th century society often prevented effective communication and decision-making on polar expeditions. Officers who knew little about practical survival made decisions that endangered their men, while experienced sailors who understood the dangers were not consulted or were ignored. Some polar disasters might have been prevented if expeditions had been organized more democratically, with decisions based on expertise rather than social rank. The tradition of naval discipline, which served well in normal circumstances, sometimes proved counterproductive in survival situations where flexibility and practical knowledge were more important than hierarchy. The economic motivations behind polar exploration also shaped outcomes in important ways. Many expeditions were underfunded or faced pressure to economize on equipment and supplies. The false economy of bringing inadequate clothing, insufficient food, or unreliable equipment contributed to numerous disasters. The competition between nations and individuals for polar firsts sometimes led to rushed or poorly planned expeditions. The pressure to beat rivals to geographical goals caused explorers to take unnecessary risks or to proceed with inadequate preparation. The commercialization of polar exploration through book sales, lecture tours, and newspaper coverage created financial incentives that sometimes conflicted with safety considerations. Explorers who needed to generate publicity and revenue might attempt more dramatic or dangerous expeditions than were prudent. These economic pressures help explain why some expeditions proceeded despite obvious warning signs or inadequate preparation. The financial and reputational costs of cancelling or postponing an expedition often seemed greater than the risks of proceeding. The technological limitations of early polar exploration are obvious in retrospect, but were not always apparent to contemporary explorers. The steam engines that powered Franklin's ships seemed like marvels of modern technology, but they proved useless when the ships became trapped in ice. The canned food that was supposed to provide nutrition for years turned out to be slowly poisoning the men who ate it. The gap between technological promise and actual performance was often fatal in polar conditions. Equipment that worked perfectly in temperate climates failed catastrophically in extreme cold. Navigation instruments designed for use at sea proved inaccurate or unreliable on polar ice. Early explorers were often overly optimistic about the capabilities of their equipment and the reliability of their supply systems. They planned expeditions based on best-case scenarios, rather than preparing for the inevitable equipment failures and supply shortages that characterized polar travel. The lesson that emerges from these technological failures is the importance of redundancy and conservative planning in extreme environments. Modern polar expeditions typically carry multiple backup systems for critical equipment and plan for much higher failure rates than early explorers anticipated. The medical understanding available to early polar explorers was often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting, mercury treatments, and other standard medical practices of the time often weakened patients rather than helping them. The lack of understanding about vitamin deficiency diseases, the effects of cold exposure, and the importance of sanitation contributed to unnecessary deaths. Expedition doctors were typically trained in conventional medicine that had little relevance to polar survival. They often lacked the practical experience and folk knowledge that might have kept their patients alive in extreme conditions. The medicalization of polar exploration may have sometimes prevented expeditions from adopting survival strategies that seemed medically unsound but were actually effective. The rejection of indigenous survival techniques because they did not conform to European medical theory may have cost lives. Modern wilderness medicine has learned from the mistakes of early polar medicine, emphasizing practical survival techniques over theoretical medical knowledge. The recognition that prevention is more important than treatment in extreme environments has revolutionized approach to polar health and safety. The nutritional understanding available to early polar explorers was also severely limited. The importance of vitamin C in preventing scurvy was not generally understood until the early 20th century. The caloric requirements for polar travel were often underestimated. The psychological effects of malnutrition on decision-making and group dynamics were not recognized. Many polar expeditions carried adequate total calories, but failed to provide the specific nutrients needed for health in extreme conditions. The reliance on preserved foods eliminated many essential vitamins and minerals. The emphasis on familiar European foods, rather than local alternatives, may have contributed to nutritional deficiencies. The modern understanding of sports nutrition and extreme environment physiology would have prevented many polar disasters. The recognition that cold exposure dramatically increases caloric requirements, that certain vitamins are essential for immune function, and that dehydration is a serious risk, even in cold environments, could have saved many lives. The communication limitations of early polar exploration meant that expeditions were completely cut off from the outside world for months or years at a time. This isolation prevented expeditions from calling for help when things went wrong, and prevented rescue organizations from knowing where to look for missing expeditions. The psychological effects of complete isolation were severe and often underestimated. Modern research on isolation and confinement has shown that communication with the outside world is essential for maintaining mental health during long-duration missions. The lack of communication also meant that expeditions could not benefit from updated weather information, navigation data, or survival advice that might have been available from other sources. They were forced to make critical decisions based on incomplete and often outdated information. Modern satellite communication systems have revolutionized polar safety by allowing continuous contact between expeditions and support teams. The ability to call for help, receive weather updates, and consult with experts has dramatically reduced the death rate in polar exploration. The navigation limitations of early polar exploration were another major factor in expedition failures. Magnetic compasses were unreliable near the magnetic poles. Celestial navigation was impossible during the polar night, and difficult in cloudy conditions. Dead reckoning was almost useless on moving ice. Many expeditions became lost and wandered for weeks or months trying to find their intended destinations. The inability to determine exact position led to missed supply depots, wrong turns, and ultimately death from starvation and exposure. The modern GPS system has eliminated most navigation problems in polar exploration. The ability to determine exact position at any time, and in any weather conditions, has prevented countless potential disasters. But GPS also illustrates the ongoing vulnerability of polar explorers to technological failure. Modern expeditions that rely entirely on electronic navigation systems can still become lost if their equipment fails. The basic skills of map and compass navigation remain essential backup capabilities. The weather prediction available to early polar explorers was virtually non-existent. Expeditions had no warning of approaching storms, temperature changes, or other dangerous weather conditions. They were forced to travel blind through some of the most volatile weather systems on Earth. Many polar disasters were triggered by sudden weather changes that caught expeditions unprepared. The ability to predict and prepare for severe weather could have prevented many deaths. Modern weather forecasting and satellite monitoring have dramatically improved polar safety. Expeditions can now receive detailed weather predictions and warnings of approaching storms. The ability to plan travel around weather systems has reduced the risk of being caught in deadly conditions. But polar weather remains inherently unpredictable and dangerous. Even modern forecasting cannot prevent all weather-related disasters. The basic principles of polar survival, always being prepared for the worst possible conditions, remain as important today as they were 150 years ago. The search and rescue capabilities available to early polar explorers were extremely limited. When expeditions went missing, It often took years to organize search efforts, and searchers had no idea where to look in the vast polar regions. Many polar explorers died, knowing that even if someone were looking for them, the searchers would never find them in time. This knowledge must have added enormously to the psychological burden of expedition members facing disaster. Modern search and rescue systems using aircraft, satellites, and emergency beacons have dramatically improved the chances of survival for expeditions that encounter trouble. The knowledge that help can be summoned quickly has reduced the psychological pressure on modern polar explorers. But the polar regions remain so vast and remote that search and rescue is still extremely difficult and time-consuming. Even with modern technology, expeditions that get into serious trouble are still largely on their own for the critical first few days or weeks. The lessons learned from failed polar expeditions have applications far beyond polar exploration itself. The principles of survival in extreme environments, leadership under stress, and group dynamics in isolation are relevant to space exploration, deep-sea research, military operations, and emergency response. NASA studies polar exploration extensively as preparation for Mars missions and other long-duration space flights. The psychological and physiological challenges of polar expeditions closely parallel those of space exploration. The isolation, confinement, dangerous environment, and inability to return home quickly create similar stresses. Military organizations use polar exploration case studies to train leaders for extreme situations. The decision-making challenges faced by polar expedition leaders are similar to those faced by military commanders in combat situations. Emergency response organizations study polar disasters to understand how people behave in survival situations and how to organize effective rescue operations in remote areas. The interdisciplinary nature of polar exploration, combining geography, meteorology, biology, psychology, medicine, and engineering has made it a useful model for other complex expeditions and research programs. The international cooperation that has characterized modern polar research also grew out of lessons learned from early competitive expeditions. The recognition that polar regions are too dangerous and remote for purely national efforts has led to collaborative research programs that pool resources and expertise. The Antarctic Treaty, which designates Antarctica as a continent for peaceful scientific research, was directly influenced by the tragic history of competitive polar exploration. The treaty's emphasis on international cooperation and environmental protection reflects lessons learned from earlier periods when national rivalry and resource exploitation drove polar expeditions. The environmental protection protocols that now govern polar activities also grew out of recognition that the polar regions are uniquely vulnerable ecosystems that cannot withstand unrestricted human activity. The pristine wilderness that early explorers died trying to reach is now protected by international agreements that limit and regulate human presence. This environmental consciousness represents a fundamental shift in how humans view the polar regions. Early explorers saw them as territories to be conquered and exploited. Modern polar researchers see them as ecosystems to be studied and protected. The transformation of polar exploration from conquest to conservation reflects broader changes in human environmental consciousness. The same places that were once seen as hostile wastelands to be overcome are now recognized as critical components of global climate systems that must be preserved. The educational value of polar exploration history continues to grow as new research techniques reveal more details about what early explorers experienced. Archaeological investigations of polar expedition sites, forensic analysis of human remains, and experimental archaeology using period techniques all contribute to our understanding of polar exploration. These research techniques have also revealed new details about indigenous polar peoples and their survival strategies. The same archaeological methods used to study European exploration sites are being applied to ancient indigenous sites, revealing sophisticated technologies and survival strategies that developed over thousands of years. The integration of indigenous knowledge with scientific research has improved both our understanding of polar environments and our ability to work safely in them. The recognition that traditional knowledge represents sophisticated understanding of polar ecology has led to new forms of collaboration between scientists and indigenous communities. This collaboration has also revealed the extent to which early European explorers misunderstood and undervalued indigenous knowledge. The dismissal of indigenous survival techniques as primitive prevented explorers from learning methods that might have saved their lives. Modern polar research increasingly recognizes that indigenous peoples are not just sources of traditional knowledge, but active research partners who contribute their own scientific observations and analytical methods. This partnership approach represents a fundamental shift from the colonial attitudes that characterized early polar exploration. The cultural impact of polar exploration extends far beyond the scientific and geographical discoveries it produced. The stories of polar expeditions have become foundational myths in the cultures that produced them, shaping national identities and cultural values in ways that persist today. The heroic narrative of polar exploration brave men venturing into unknown territories to expand human knowledge and national glory has become a template for understanding human achievement and sacrifice. This narrative has influenced everything from space exploration to environmental activism. But the darker aspects of polar exploration, the failures, the cannibalism, the cultural arrogance have also become part of our cultural understanding. These stories serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of hubris and the importance of respecting natural limits. The tension between these heroic and tragic narratives reflects broader cultural tensions about progress, technology, and humanity's relationship with nature. Polar exploration embodies both the best and worst aspects of human ambition and achievement. The literary and artistic influence of polar exploration has been enormous. Writers from Edgar Allan Poe to Margaret Atwood have drawn inspiration from polar themes. Visual artists have found in polar landscapes metaphors for human isolation, struggle, and transcendence. The polar regions have become symbols of the sublime in art and literature, places where humans encounter forces larger than themselves and are transformed by the experience. The beauty and terror of polar environments provide powerful metaphors for psychological and spiritual states. This cultural influence continues to evolve as climate change transforms the polar regions and our understanding of them. The melting Arctic ice that defeated so many early explorers has become a symbol of human impact on global climate systems. The same polar regions that once represented the ultimate wilderness now represent the ultimate vulnerability of natural systems to human influence. The transformation of polar ice from an insurmountable barrier to a disappearing resource has fundamentally changed how we think about these environments. The stories of failed polar expeditions remain relevant precisely because they remind us of natural limits and human frailty at a time when technological optimism sometimes obscures these realities. The men who died in the polar regions serve as reminders that nature still has the power to humble human ambition. These stories also remind us that individual human lives have value beyond their contribution to scientific knowledge or national glory. The men who died in polar expeditions were not just abstractions or statistics, but real people with families, dreams, and fears. The detailed records that many polar explorers left behind, diaries, letters, scientific observations, provide intimate glimpses into how people face extreme adversity. These records reveal not just what happened to polar expeditions, but what it felt like to be part of them. The humanity that emerges from these records is complex and sometimes contradictory. The same men who showed extraordinary courage and determination also sometimes made terrible mistakes or committed desperate acts. Their stories remind us that heroism and failure are often separated by very thin margins. The preservation of polar exploration artifacts and sites has become an important aspect of historical conservation. The extreme cold of polar regions has preserved materials that would have long since decomposed in temperate climates. Wooden ships, leather clothing, paper documents, and even human bodies have been found in remarkably good condition, decades or centuries after being abandoned. These preserved materials provide unique windows into 19th and early 20th century technology, culture, and daily life. They also serve as monuments to the men who died using them. Physical reminders of human struggles with extreme environments. The conservation of polar exploration sites raises complex questions about how to balance historical preservation with environmental protection and indigenous rights. Many exploration sites are located in pristine wilderness areas that are now protected by environmental regulations. The management of these sites requires careful consideration of their historical value, their environmental impact, and their significance to indigenous communities who may have their own connections to these places. Some polar exploration sites have become pilgrimage destinations for people interested in exploration history. These visits can provide powerful educational experiences, but also risk damaging fragile archaeological remains and pristine environments. The tourism industry that has developed around polar exploration history reflects the continuing fascination with these stories and their relevance to contemporary concerns about human relationships with extreme environments. The technological innovations that have emerged from polar exploration research continue to benefit society in numerous ways. Materials developed for polar clothing have found applications in everything from athletic wear to firefighting equipment. Navigation techniques developed for polar travel have influenced GPS technology and other modern systems. Medical research conducted in polar environments has advanced understanding of cold injury, altitude sickness, and the physiological effects of extreme environments. This research has applications in treating victims of accidents, natural disasters, and other emergencies. The psychological research conducted with polar expedition members has contributed to understanding of stress, isolation, and group dynamics. This research has applications in designing work environments, managing teams, and treating psychological disorders. The engineering challenges of polar exploration have driven innovations in materials, science, energy systems, and construction techniques. Solutions developed for polar problems often find applications in other extreme environments or challenging construction projects. The environmental monitoring techniques developed for polar research have become essential tools for understanding global climate change. The same regions that once challenged human survival now serve as early warning systems for planetary environmental changes. This transformation of polar regions from obstacles to instruments of understanding reflects the broader evolution of human relationships with extreme environments. Places that were once seen as empty wastelands are now recognized as complex ecosystems with global significance. The scientific legacy of polar exploration continues to grow as new research techniques reveal previously unknown aspects of polar environments and their global importance. Ice core research has revolutionized understanding of past climate changes. Polar biology has revealed unique ecosystems and evolutionary adaptations. Polar geology has provided insights into plate tectonics, mineral resources, and planetary formation processes. Polar atmospheric research has advanced understanding of ozone depletion, global circulation patterns, and climate change mechanisms. These scientific discoveries have transformed polar regions from geographical curiosities into essential components of global environmental systems. The same places where early explorers died trying to reach geographical goals are now recognized as critical to understanding planetary processes. The shift from exploration for its own sake to research for understanding represents a fundamental change in human approaches to unknown environments. Modern polar work is driven more by scientific questions than by territorial ambitions or personal glory. But the basic human drives that motivated early polar explorers' curiosity, ambition, the desire to understand remain unchanged. The men and women who work in polar regions today are driven by many of the same impulses that drove Franklin, Scott, and their contemporaries. The difference is that modern polar workers have better tools, better understanding, and better support systems. They also have the benefit of learning from the mistakes and sacrifices of their predecessors. The stories of failed polar expeditions serve as both inspiration and warning for contemporary polar work. They remind us of what can be achieved through determination and courage, but also of what can go wrong when preparation is inadequate or when natural forces are underestimated. The continuing relevance of these historical stories reflects the continuing relevance of the challenges they represent. Extreme environments remain dangerous. Places where small mistakes can have large consequences, and where human beings must still rely on skill, preparation, and luck to survive. The polar regions that claimed so many lives in the past continue to demand respect and careful preparation from anyone who ventures into them. The fundamental hostility of these environments to human life has not changed, even if our tools for dealing with them have improved. The men who died in the polar regions did not die in vain if their deaths contribute to safer and more successful polar work today. Their sacrifices become meaningful when they prevent similar tragedies and advance human understanding of extreme environments. The preservation of their stories and the lessons they contain is therefore not just a matter of historical interest, but of practical importance for anyone who faces similar challenges today. The past continues to inform the present in places where the basic conditions of survival remain largely unchanged. As we face new challenges in space exploration, deep-sea research, and other extreme environments, the lessons learned from polar exploration remain relevant. The basic principles of survival, leadership, and group dynamics that determined success or failure in polar expeditions apply to any situation where humans venture into hostile environments. The courage, determination, and sacrifice of early polar explorers continue to inspire people facing their own challenges and pursuing their own goals. Their stories remind us that human achievement often requires accepting significant risks and making difficult sacrifices. But their failures also remind us that courage and determination are not always enough. Success in extreme environments requires careful planning, appropriate equipment, realistic expectations, and respect for natural forces that are larger than human ambition. The balance between inspiration and caution that these stories provide is perhaps their greatest value. They encourage us to pursue ambitious goals while reminding us of the importance of preparation and humility. The polar regions themselves remain as challenging and dangerous as they ever were. Climate change is altering their characteristics, but not eliminating their fundamental hostility to human life. New challenges are emerging as ice patterns change and weather systems shift. The men who died trying to understand and explore these regions would probably be amazed by how much we now know about polar environments. They would also probably be saddened by how much these environments are now threatened by human activities. The transformation of polar regions from unknown wilderness to threatened ecosystems represents both the success and the failure of human exploration and development. We have achieved the geographical and scientific goals that early explorers died pursuing, but at the cost of fundamentally altering the environments they died trying to understand. This irony gives additional poignancy to the stories of failed polar expeditions. The men who died in the ice were not just casualties of human ambition, but early victims of the same industrial civilization that eventually conquered the polar regions and is now destroying them. Their deaths were part of the same historical process that now threatens the very existence of polar ice. The steam engines that powered some expedition ships were early examples of the fossil fuel technology that is now melting polar ice at unprecedented rates. The recognition of this connection between polar exploration and environmental destruction adds another layer of meaning to these historical stories. They remind us that human progress often comes at environmental costs that may not be apparent until long after the immediate goals have been achieved. The challenge for contemporary polar workers is to learn from the past while protecting the future. The same regions where early explorers died are now laboratories for understanding environmental change and developing strategies for environmental protection. The transformation of polar regions from territories to be conquered into ecosystems to be protected represents perhaps the most important lesson that can be drawn from the history of polar exploration. The shift from exploitation to conservation reflects a fundamental change in human relationships with the natural world. This change did not come easily or quickly. It required the accumulation of scientific knowledge, the development of environmental consciousness, and the recognition that human activities could have global consequences. The men who died in polar expeditions contributed to this transformation, even though they could not have foreseen it. Their struggles to understand polar environments provided the foundation for later scientific work that revealed the global importance of these regions. Their deaths were not meaningless if they contributed to understanding that now helps protect polar environments and the global climate systems they influence. The knowledge gained through their sacrifice continues to benefit humanity in ways they could never have imagined. The stories of failed polar expeditions thus serve multiple purposes. They provide historical insight into past human activities and achievements. They offer practical lessons for contemporary work in extreme environments. They remind us of the costs of human ambition and the importance of environmental protection. Most importantly, they remind us that individual human lives matter, regardless of the larger historical processes they are part of. The men who died in polar expeditions were not just symbols or statistics, but real people whose suffering and sacrifice deserve to be remembered and honored. Their stories continue to resonate because they represent fundamental aspects of human experience. The desire to explore and understand, the courage to face unknown dangers, the strength to endure extreme hardships, and the tragedy of lives cut short by circumstances beyond human control. These themes remain relevant because they reflect ongoing aspects of human nature and human circumstances. As long as humans continue to push boundaries and explore unknown territories, the lessons of polar exploration will remain valuable. The polar regions where so many early explorers died continue to call to contemporary adventurers and researchers. The same landscapes that defeated Franklin and Scott continue to challenge modern expeditions, though with much better prospects for survival and success. This continuity between past and present polar exploration reflects the timeless appeal of extreme environments and the continuing human need to test ourselves against natural challenges. The basic human drives that motivated early polar explorers remain active in contemporary exploration and research. The difference is that we now know much more about what we are getting into. The accumulated knowledge and experience of more than 2 centuries of polar exploration provide modern expeditions with resources that early explorers could only dream of. But this knowledge comes with responsibility. We know the costs that polar exploration can exact in human lives and environmental damage. We have an obligation to learn from past mistakes and to pursue polar activities in ways that minimize these costs. The stories of failed polar expeditions remind us of this responsibility. They show us what can happen when exploration is pursued without adequate preparation, realistic expectations, or respect for natural forces. They also show us what humans are capable of when pushed to extremes. The courage, determination, and sacrifice displayed by polar explorers represent some of the finest aspects of human character. The challenge is to honor this heritage while avoiding its mistakes. The goal is to pursue understanding and achievement while respecting both human life and environmental integrity. The polar regions that have claimed so many lives over the centuries remain among the most powerful and inspiring environments on Earth. They continue to challenge human ingenuity, courage, and determination. They also continue to provide essential insights into global environmental processes and climate change. The men who died trying to understand these regions would probably be pleased to know that their sacrifices contributed to knowledge that now helps protect global climate stability. Their deaths were not in vain if they advance human understanding and environmental protection. The lessons of polar exploration extend far beyond the polar regions themselves. They apply to any situation where humans face extreme challenges, work in dangerous environments, or pursue ambitious goals despite significant risks. These lessons remind us that success in extreme environments requires more than courage and determination. It requires careful planning, appropriate preparation, realistic expectations, and respect for forces larger than human ambition. They also remind us that failure is always possible, regardless of how well prepared or experienced we may be. The polar regions have humbled some of the most skilled and experienced explorers in history. But failure does not negate the value of the attempt. The men who died in polar expeditions advanced human knowledge and understanding, even when they did not achieve their immediate goals. Their failures were as educational as their successes. The continuing study of polar exploration history provides ongoing benefits for contemporary work in extreme environments. Each new discovery about past expeditions contributes to understanding that can prevent future tragedies. The polar regions themselves continue to yield new insights into past exploration activities. Archaeological work at expedition sites, forensic analysis of human remains, and environmental research all contribute to ongoing understanding of what early explorers experienced. This research also contributes to understanding of polar environments and their changes over time. The same regions where early explorers struggled and died now serve as natural laboratories for studying environmental change and climate history. The transformation of polar regions from unknown territories into scientific resources represents the ultimate legacy of polar exploration. The deaths of early explorers were not in vain if they contributed to understanding that now benefits all humanity. But this legacy also comes with obligations. The knowledge gained through past sacrifices must be used responsibly to protect both human life and environmental integrity in future polar activities. The stories of failed polar expeditions provide both inspiration and guidance for meeting these obligations. They remind us of what humans can achieve through courage and determination. They also remind us of what can be lost through inadequate preparation or disrespect for natural forces. The balance between ambition and caution that these stories represent is perhaps their most important lesson. They encourage us to pursue worthy goals while reminding us of the importance of preparation, humility, and respect for environments that are larger and more powerful than human ambition. As we face contemporary challenges in polar regions and other extreme environments, these historical lessons remain relevant and valuable. The basic principles of survival, leadership, and environmental respect that determine success or failure in polar expeditions continue to apply to modern activities. The men who died in polar expeditions left us more than just cautionary tales. They left us examples of human courage, determination, and sacrifice that continue to inspire people facing their own challenges and pursuing their own goals. Their deaths were not meaningless if they contribute to safer and more successful human activities in extreme environments. Their sacrifices become meaningful when they prevent similar tragedies and advance human understanding of our planet and our place in it. The polar regions where they died continue to challenge and inspire new generations of explorers, researchers, and adventurers. The same landscapes that defeated some of history's most experienced explorers continue to test human ingenuity and determination. But we face these challenges with better knowledge, better equipment, and better understanding of what we are attempting. The accumulated wisdom of polar exploration provides modern expeditions with resources that can prevent many of the tragedies that befell early explorers. This knowledge comes with responsibility to use it wisely and to honor the memory of those who died to acquire it. The best way to honor early polar explorers is to learn from their experiences and to pursue polar activities in ways that minimize risks to both human life and environmental integrity. The stories of failed polar expeditions remind us that exploration and discovery always involve risks and sometimes require sacrifices. They also remind us that these risks and sacrifices can be meaningful if they contribute to knowledge that benefits humanity. The challenge for contemporary polar workers is to pursue understanding and achievement while respecting the lessons of the past and the integrity of polar environments. The goal is to build on the legacy of early polar explorers while avoiding their mistakes. The polar regions themselves remain as magnificent and terrible as they ever were. They continue to demand respect, preparation, and humility from anyone who ventures into them. They also continue to reward those who approach them with appropriate caution and understanding. The men who died in these regions were pioneers who paid the price for knowledge that now benefits all of us. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as ongoing sources of insight and inspiration. Their legacy lives on in every successful polar expedition, every scientific discovery made in polar regions, and every life saved by the knowledge gained through their sacrifice. They died so that we might understand, and through understanding, survive and thrive in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The cold that killed them continues to challenge us. The ice that trapped them continues to shift and move. The isolation that broke them continues to test human endurance and sanity. But we face these challenges with the wisdom they brought with their lives. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial to the men who died in the polar regions. Not monuments of stone or bronze, but the living legacy of knowledge that continues to guide and protect those who follow in their footsteps into the beautiful, terrible world of ice and snow and endless cold.